Hello and welcome everyone to this new session of the Salon of Classical Architecture. Today we're doing in a different date because of some problems with my calendar, but we need to continue. We need to carry on. The show must go on, and that's what we're going to do today. For those you're attending and those who aren't, remember that you can also watch our recording. I see that more people are coming, and welcome to everyone who is joining. What I'm going to do, uh, Alvaro, if you don't mind, I'm going to make you co-host, and if you see people arriving in the waiting room, you just admit them. Yes, not to make them wait in case I don't see them. I should see all of them, but let's carry on. So, as you might remember, last season we went through our 12 sessions on principles for classical architecture, and with this autumn we decided to go for something a little bit different, something that will include also readings and something that would connect a little bit more with what has happened in 20th century. And that's what we have called, the overall name of this season is Precursors of Modern Tradition. And today we have the first part on that, which is the last generation of classicists. So as you can see in our program, we already did the traditional architectural education in Spain. And we have today the first of the four lectures on precursors of modern tradition. We will have in 2 weeks' time, by the 18th of October, we will have a monograph class on modernism by Reginald Blomfield, which is a book that has been already shared in the WhatsApp group. If you haven't seen it in the WhatsApp group, please ask in the group for it and we will redirect you to where it is so that you can download and you can read it, because we are going to be working on it, to discuss, to comment. I believe it's a very interesting book to understand how classicism opposed to modernism in the years in which modernism was supposed to be triumphant. And it is interesting because it's has been basically the only architect, the only book that actually opposed modernism up until postmodern times arrived. Then we will carry on with the second batch of this lecture, which is Precursors of Modern Tradition, which in this case is it's going to be those architects, that generation of architects which was already combining with the modernists. We're going to see a little bit more in a moment. We will have a special guest, Alexander Keys, who's going to talk about architecture and symbolism and what actually means traditional architecture. And then the two last sessions before Christmas are going to be about those architects who thrive in the 50s and 60s and were still doing classical architecture. And finally, we're going to talk about those masters of restoration, those architects who work on restorations and whom, to many of you, because in all the WhatsApp groups, in all our debates, we are always talking about the Chart of Athens. So we're going to see people who probably you might think that they challenge the Chart of Athens, but actually they just oblige the spirit of the Chart of Athens by doing what they did. And I'm not going to talk about all modernist interventions. We're going to talk about architects who did the restoration in a traditional manner, in a completing in the style, but without having to enter into that. And we will go on, we will dive onto that. And the Classic Planning Academy is organizing for 2026 a seminar on restoration. We will be informing you more about as we refine the details, but that will be a separate thing from the Salon of Classical Architecture. It will be a different day. It will be an extra activity, more linked to the Classic Planning Academy rather than the Salon, which is something that is sponsored by the Classic Planning Academy and the Traditional Architectural Group, but at the same time, it's independent of all of them. So carry on. As we say, today we're going to talk about, the title is The Last Generation of Classicists. And with this, I mean, we're going to see examples of the last generation of architects who had a classical training and who gave a classical response to modern needs. And this is important to talk, because one of the things that we are always told about modernism is that that classical architecture wasn't able to give a response to the needs of the modern society, to the needs appeared after the second industrial revolution. And the truth is that actually these architects gave an answer, very good answer to that, but then they were just unfairly forgotten on the sequence of events that came aftermath. So in order to see this as well, I want you to understand the timeline we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about this conceptual time frame is the one that we're going to be managing all these, the 2 months that we're going to be talking about this. We have on one side the period between 1871 and 1914, which is the so-called the Belle Epoque. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Those are the years in which we're going to focus today. Then we First World War with all the problems inherent to it. Obviously, this is not going to be a case for to do a bellic speech about the First and Second World War. I mean, there is amazing books and documentaries for you to enjoy them. And we're going to be focusing on architectural consequences or the architectural consequences of that. Then between 1918 and 1939, we have the interwar period, the interbellum, the roaring 20s, the Great Depression, the ascent of totalitarianisms, etc. And how that architecture in this time, modernism was just a minority option, and mostly everyone was still moving on to the tradition, and how even Art Deco wasn't perceived as something different. Art Deco was a variant on classical. It was like if you want to say so, ultra neoclassicism, in the same way that 100 years before, what in England is called the Regency style or the federal style in the United States, or the Greek revival everywhere else, was perceived as a coming back to some order after all the excesses of Baroque and neoclassicism. Then, after the Second World War, we have what you could call the golden years of modernism. And this means the years in which modernism thrived, in which modernism actually expanded through all over the world, when it became the only valid and possible architectural expression. And we will talk about it, how heaven was taken by assault, if you want to use that terminology from the Commune of Paris. And finally, we are stopping at 1972. And I don't know if you know why is 1972 and why I have put here the end of modernity, according to Charles Jenck. Does any of you know why I am putting 1972 in here? No, if you can write it, you can write it in the chat. Peak oil, no, that was 1973, and the peak oil apparently we haven't arrived. We haven't got there yet. The 1973 was the oil crisis, but that was before, and it's not related with oil or with wars. It's a proper architecture event. It was the demolition of Prut Ego, which was a social housing complex in Chicago that was built in the 50s, following all the principles of modernism, and had decayed badly in 20 years to the point it had to be demolished. So that meant that all the utopias that modernism had about all this architecture, they were just experiments, they were just social experiments that didn't end up well. And for Charles Jenks, that's like the demonstration that this didn't work. And actually, when we make a bit of a reference, we make a bit of a Pruitt ego. And when we talk about when we talk about that, it's just to realize that at the end of these modernist utopias, it ended up being dystopias, and that's it. It's just this end of brutalism, this fact that the architecture, that modernist architecture wasn't serving the purpose. All these things that we are told usually about, no, modernism was necessary because it was for social purposes and it made a purpose and it gave a lot of social housing. No, the only thing it did was provide with quick housing after the war, and then 20 years after it was not enough. But we will see that in due course. So we're going to be focusing on these years, which was called the Belle Epoque. And the Belle Epoque is a very French name. It's focused on the years 1871, which is the end of the Second French Empire, and the beginning of the Third Republic, up until 1914, which is the year of when the World War first started. What happened on these years in France? We had the peak of the Second Industrial Revolution that has happened everywhere. We have an extreme expansion of colonialism, of colonial powers. There is the Conference of Berlin in 1885, where the whole Africa is divided. There was all this ongoing debate about how to intervene in China and how to do the spread or any potential partition of China. We have the Russian expansion. We have the American expansion and the clashing with the Spanish and the annexation of Panama. So we have quite a lot of things happening around. And at the same time, all the nations involved, they had similar periods of prosperity. There was a short stagnation, and then eventually things started to go better. And it received different names. What in France is the Belle Epoque, in England, in the UK, would be the late Victorian or the Edwardian era. In the United States, it's the American Gilded Age. A lot of you should know from the different TV show, but also the American Progressive Era, which is just what follows the Gilded Age. I have put 1898, which is when the Spanish-American War and Spanish loses Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Mexico, we have the Porfiriato. We have the major restoration in Japan, the German Empire from 1871 to 1999. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was founded in 1867 and finishing in 1918. The Spanish, and then we have like two odd things that start more or less at the same time, but end much later, which has the Spanish Restoration, which means that in 1868, the Spanish had a revolution. We kick out the Bourbons. We had 6 years of experiments. We tried every possible form of government, republics, constitutional monarchies, dictatorships. We tried everything, and we came back to the Bourbons with another monarchy. So the Bourbons were restored, and the first Brazilian Republic. And why have I put here that the spirit of the Belle Epoque continues up until so late in Spain and in Brazil? It was because they were not involved in the First World War. So these countries, together with many others, they didn't see the clash of the war, but they didn't live the roaring 20s with the same intensity because they didn't see a different timing. So for them, the war was something abroad, and they didn't see that there were changes that were coming from fashion, etc. But there were things that you were importing. The internal dynamics were remaining the same on that regard. And then, yeah, I mean, for example, in Mexico, it starts before because then there is that civil war. The major restoration is not that nothing happened after. It means that, I mean, a different era came afterward. But as you can see, I mean, we have a selection of some Western countries and their empires had a similar period that can be identified. So more or less all of them were living a similar story, and we're going to see some glimpses of it today. One of the first things that was one of the characteristics that was also uniting all this Belle Epoque and was a showcase for everyone on what was happening everywhere in the world were the universal and international exhibitions. If you check Wikipedia, the list is endless, but I have only put here the ones that were officially selected by the committee because the international exhibitions are appointed by a committee. And we have 1873 in Vienna, 1876 Philadelphia, what a centennial exhibition, 1878 Paris, 1888 Barcelona, very important for Barcelona because it was the showcase as a modern city in Spain. The 1889 in Paris, probably the most famous of all the Parisian exhibitions with the Tour Eiffel. The 1893 in Chicago, which is also a very important international exhibition because it settled what in America and United States was called the City Beautiful movement, which was the Europeization of the American city, the house, you can even say the Haussmannization of the American city. Another one, 1887 in Brussels, more in 1900 in Paris, 1904 St. Louis to commemorate the purchase of Louisiana by the United States, because for the Americans listening, all the area, what it is not the Midwest, was Spanish, and then it was sold back to the French. It was initially French, then the French gave it to the Spanish. It was more time Spanish than French, and then Napoleon took it back from Spain and sold it to the United States. So that's the St. Louis Fair, which is also the name called, is that was in 1904 in St. Louis. There is a famous movie which is Judy Garland called Wait Me in St. Louis. Meet Me in St. Louis. So it's about that. It's about the exhibition. It's an old musical from the 1940s. That was another one, 1905 in Liège, 1906 in Milan, 1910 in Brussels, 1913 in Ghent. There were other plans, but they never happened because of the war. The only one which continued was the San Diego exhibition of 1915 to commemorate the finishing of the Panama Canal. And we're going to see a little glimpse to all of them. I have decided to, because if you haven't taken, sorry, Guillem, if at the beginning we were saying that with this period of today, we are going to stop in 1914. So that's why we're not talking about the exhibition of 1929 in Sevilla and in Barcelona, for example, or the 1924 in Paris, or the 1937 in Paris, as well as many others. We are not talking about them because we will be talking about them in a next class. Today we're focusing, as we said, in the Belle Epoque, 1871, 1914, even others have either other countries, the Belle Epoque lasts longer, but I put them as succession rather than as rules. But don't worry, we will have plenty of time to talk about Aníbal González and the exhibition of 1929. As those architects who were thriving in a period in which, when you read all the manuals, all the books, technically everything was modernist. No, it's when they talk about the pavilion of Mies van der Rohe in the Barcelona exhibition of 1929, actually was the only modernist building in the whole exhibition. All the rest were like the so-called eclecticism. I don't like the term, but that's how they call, like, misclassified. So, as I was saying, the exhibition of Paris in 1889 is one of the most important because of two buildings. First one is the Tour Eiffel, which became a symbol of Paris despite being heavily hated by all the Parisians, to the point in which the people who were living, you can see that there were quartiers either side of the Champs-Élysées. Those people made a complaint and contracted very, very expensive insurances for the time to ensure that the houses would be easily reconstructed, or they had like compensation for when the Tour Eiffel would fall onto their houses. So they were thinking that it was going to fall. It was the tallest building done until then. It was more than double of the tallest buildings of the time, which I think it was the Cathedral of Ulm, which was around 140, 150 something meters, definitely bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, which for 5,000 years had been the tallest structure ever built by mankind. And the other building was the Galerie des Machines, the gallery of machines, the engine galleries, which had a span of around 115 meters, which was one of the biggest ones achieved until then. So it was a massive covered space that was the surprise for the whole world. And it was the showcase of Paris to show the centennial, the century of the French Revolution, and at the same time celebrate its recovery after the fall of the Second Empire and the glories of the Republic. After that, we have the exhibition of Chicago in 1893, which settled what it was so successful and it was so well cared And Chicago had been recovering so good after the fire that everyone was super surprised and super pleased with the exhibition, to the point in which it originated a movement which was called City Beautiful, inspired in the planning, composition and the planning design of the exhibition, and the improvement of Chicago after the fire. It would be called like that, the City Beautiful movement. And it was also the origin of this famous book that I know a lot of you have known. And if you don't know this book, it's one of the ones that you should read, which is the American Vitruvius, an Architect Handbook of Civic Art by Bernard Hegeman and Elbert Pitts. Even if it is called American Vitruvius, and even if it is focused a lot on how to design the American city, it is one of the best books of urbanism, post-Haussmannian urbanism. And I would say that, I mean, I know that a lot of you like Camilo Sitte, and Camilo Sitte is always recommended to read. Camilo Sitte's book is a wonderful book to read. But I think that Hegeman and Pitt is also a very, very useful reading, especially for city planning when we want to go for grids and for a bit more of an orderly manner. Hegeman and Pitts, it's your choice, as opposed to the organicism that you can see in Camilo Sitte. For the exhibition of 1900 in Paris, this was to celebrate the turn of the century, which was the again more glories of the French Republic. And in this case, in terms of architecture itself, there was not big grandeur gesture. There were a lot of smaller things, and on top of that, the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais. So there was a lot of recycling from the previous exhibition, like the Galerie des Machines, the Tour Eiffel, the Palais du Trocadero. All that was recycled, but it was to commemorate more glories of the Republic. And you can see here is all these people here are the rulers of the world who are visiting. You can see here Queen Victoria sitting there, the young Alfonso XIII, the Sultan of Turkey, and many of the Kaiser, Wilhelm, Franz Joseph. Here you can see Franz Joseph of Austria, etc., etc. The Emperor of Abyssinia. So you can see many of the rulers visiting and admiring all the wonders that you were seeing in the Industrial Revolutions. And I have put here, I mean, this is the catalog of the exhibition. You can find it on archive.org. I recommend all of you to read it because it has plans and elevations of many of the buildings shown there, and you can use them as inspiration. Because one of the most interesting things that this exhibition had, as opposed to the other, is that it had a much more leisure aspect, which meant that it had a lot of recreational villages of all types. Probably today they would be considered heavily offensive to even the most progressive standard, or even for the most conservative standard, they would be considered heavily offensive. But the architecture is very interesting. The effort that they made to create those evocative architecture were very interesting. And as you can see, they were doing everything. You can see a bit of a Bedouin with their rifle. You can see some Orientalists, but there was a recreation of a Spanish village, a recreation of a bullfighting. Indians, Buffalo Bill was there. So there was a lot of things happening. And not forget the Olympics of 1900s, which were like one activity more of all those fun things that were being done in the exhibition of 1900. I'm closing this section with the exhibition of Ghent, which was again very, very important. I mean, it was the one that closed all this Belle Epoque in Europe before the horrors of the war. And as even compared with, I mean, I'm putting Ghent, I'm not putting the Warburg exhibition of 1914, because this one was more into the sort of overall international showcase, where the Warburg was more a German one. But we will talk about the Warbund when we touch the next session, because it will be important to know what was going on in the Warbund and who was doing what. And finally, the San Diego exhibition of 1915, which created the Balboa Park, which is still visitable, is still there in San Diego. And it is a very, very interesting. It shaped the style and architecture of Southern California quite a lot. And all the architects who were Americans, fiercely anti-Hispanic, they managed to create a very genuine mix of Spanish Baroque and Mexican Baroque there, and at the same time genuinely American. So it was like the proper Southern Californian expression of the architecture of the United States. And still nowadays, this is the Balboa Park. These are some of the buildings that were done for the exhibition. So they are still there. And I know that some of you in the group, that in the WhatsApp group, they have been seeing recently yesterday, one of the members was sharing some images of a chart that he had drawn for us for the Classic Planning Academy and had applied on Nano Banana to get a much more photorealistic image that you want that you get a chat GPT. And yeah, he was getting these similar sort of colors and textures in San Diego. And for those of you who are from Spain, you see this, and at the same time that a lot of Mexicans will feel identified with this architecture, a lot of Spanish. I'm sure that you are seeing here Jose de Churriguera and all the Churrigueresco style and a bit of Andalusia as well in there. So this was a bit of something that few people talk anymore in the United States, but it was something very popular, very important in the United States back then as part of the defining the identity of the southwest coast of the country. I think that nowadays what is remaining of that is just little glimpsing of what they call the Pueblo style, the Mission style, but are like very simplified versions of that. But they are there to be reused or to be inspired from whenever anyone wants to use them. But the root is Spanish. And there is an anecdote, there is a short novel, a satiric novel actually, called Nancy's Thesis, La Tesis de Nancy, which is about a girl from California, from South California. I don't remember if it's from Los Angeles or from San Diego, that comes to Spain after the Civil War, Spanish Civil War, to study history. And she studies in Sevilla. And then when she arrives to Sevilla, she is a bit disappointed because she says that the whole Sevilla is built in fake California style. So she had identified that what it is that typical architecture of Andalusia was so Californian that the original one, she perceived it as a copy of what she saw in California. So, and as I was saying as well, it's important to note the Olympic Games, 1896 in Athens, which was the first one of modern history. We still have the stadium, which was reused for the Olympics in 2004. No, in 2000, sorry. Yeah, the Olympics in Athens were, no, in 2004. Well, 1996 was Atlanta, 2000 Sydney, 2004 Athens. In 1900 in Paris, in 1904 St. Louis, and then in 1908 they went to London, in 1912 they went to Stockholm. In 1916 they were going to be in Berlin, and obviously it didn't happen, and then we go to 1920 in Antwerp. Very depopulated Olympics. But when we will be talking about the next batch of the Olympics, we will be talking about the architectural competitions in the Olympics, because as the whole discipline wasn't settled and the whole purpose of the Olympics was also train your body and your mind, there were literary, painting, sculpture, and architectural competitions as part of that. You might sound quirky, but remember, just for you to put, the 1900 exhibition in Paris had like sack races on there, and like races in which you have to get the spoon with an egg and take the spoon in your mouth. Those were Olympic disciplines in the 1900 games in Paris, and St. Louis was even worse, to the point in which they decided not to link them anymore with exhibitions. There were like any competition you could imagine. Let's see who eats more German sausages, things like that. They were happening in Paris and St. Louis in those exhibitions that were taking out seriousness to the event, and that's why they started to put the games in London and Stockholm were actually very professional and quite well remembered. So now we enter into this term that we have been talking around, because Whenever you check what's the architecture of the Beaux-Arts of the Belle Epoque, they will tell you it was an architecture that was eclectic. People didn't know what they were doing. They were mixing everything, and everything was like a mix. They didn't make it much sense. And once you start looking at what they were doing, everything made sense. They were not just crazy people just putting everything as if you were like a 3-year-old kid that all of a sudden opened the mom's wardrobe and put all the mom's clothes at the same time. No, the shoes, the hat, the pajama, and then on top of the pajama, the coat. No, that was not the case. It was called eclecticism because people were coming from a period in which you had one style per era. No? When there was Baroque, everyone was Baroque. Then when they came with neoclassicism, everyone turned into neoclassicism. Then when neoclassicism started to get simplified, came the Greek revival, and everyone dived into the Greek revival. But at the same time Greek revival was appearing, the Gothic revival was in rise. And then that created a debate, no? Because people were perceiving that it could only be either Greek revival or Gothic revival. Both of them couldn't exist at the same time. And people started to at the same time that the Greek revivalists and the Gothic revivalists were just yelling at each other, Islamic revival appears. No? It's when Jones brings the plans and elevation of the Alhambra. And when different Gothic revivals appear, no? It's when they try to define which is the perfect Gothic. No? They realize that Gothic evolves from 12th century to 16th century, and there are as many expressions as churches are there. So the Gothic revivalists felt that they were losing the battle of the styles. And then they started to define, no. If you want to do a house of this type, you need to use Gothic from 1372 on the 8th of October at 9 o'clock in the morning. But if it was the 8th of October at 9:30, no. So they started to become very particular, very picky, to create massive catalogs to classify every single molding, to put labels on everything. No, we are now in a time in which certain people like labeling everyone, and everyone has to have a label, everyone has to have pronouns, everything. This comes from that 19th century obsession of classifying everything and then showing a lot of disdain for things that they couldn't be classified. So everything had to fit in a box predetermined by them. And if it didn't fit, it was not correct. That's why many times they were omitting. And there are things that when you say, oh, this part of history, they never told you, because in 19th century, whatever couldn't be perfectly classified and put in the pre-made framework or drawers would be omitted. And it's when we talk about as well, when we talk about restoration, and when the thing is when they realized that it was more that the material that showed the stone wall was more important than the render wall, and they removed all the render and all the frescoes from the churches just to show the raw stone instead of the painted walls, the rendered walls with the specialist finishing. And then when people get surprised when they see pictures, no, these churches used to be this way. They were different. So it is important to note that the eclecticism appears as a sort of no man's land. Whatever we couldn't classify, we put them into eclecticism. And then they would come and see a classical building, and then they would say, oh, but that Ionic column, where are you taking it from? Are you getting inspired in classical antiquity? Then you are Roman. But your building doesn't look Roman. Your building looks sort of Venetian from the 1580s, Palladian or Escamozian, or maybe it looks Michelangelo, maybe it looks Florentine. And then they always wanted to put a label on that. So those buildings that couldn't fit onto the labels was creating all that situation that it was ended up called eclecticism with a lot of disdain, and modernists would take over all that, because we have to remember that the modernist reaction against classical and tradition comes precisely from, and especially from the neo-Gothic, from the Gothic revival reaction against classicism, and by extension, a Northern European reaction to Southern European architecture in the quest of a better architecture. That's also one of the reasons why Greek revival becomes all of a sudden so popular in Northern Europe and not so popular in Southern Europe. Why? Because for Southern Europe, the Greek revival was what they had always there. No? It was in that perspective of history, it was same as Roman and Hellenistic architecture. While for Northern Europeans, including Britain, they would see a way of getting rid of the Italian influence, which, considering that they were Protestant, it was always a bit of a dilemma that they had. You know, remember that when they rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral after the fire of London, Christopher Wren is accused of papist for building a dome, for building that dome that was to celebrate the glories of the Church of England. He was accused of being a supporter of the papacy. And one of the reasons the St. Paul's project from Wren was partially, I'm not going to say that the cause or the triggering, but all that um, big ornament, big display of architectural features of Christopher Wren was one of the part of the reaction of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But that would be for another reason, or we will be talking about Wren a little bit later. So instead, what terms could we use instead of eclecticism? Because even if it is an objective term, it has also very pejorative. There is a lot of them you can use. I still inspired on tradition, and I am omitting deliberately, because we will talk a little bit at the end, just as a side note, because again, there are places to talk about them, but I want to talk about the others. One of the typical ones is called Beaux-Arts architecture, which is all the architecture directly inspired in French models that were emanating from the École des Beaux-Arts de Paris. So, and there is a lot. I'm saying that the problems were always the Brits. You know, there is always an Anglo-Saxon creating trouble everywhere, Christian. So I didn't say the Brits, I said the Northern Europeans, but there is always the Anglo-Saxon always create troubles. Anyway, so you have the box art architecture, um, which is the architecture derived from the École des Beaux-Arts, which also has a base on Vignola and Serlio. You remember that I am always, when we talk and we discuss about classical architecture, I always tell everyone, I mean, when you come from an Anglo-Saxon sphere of influence, Palladio is your reference, but when you don't come from an Anglo-Saxon sphere of influence, your influence is French, Vignola, and Serlio. It's basically Palladio is for the English, for the Brits, and the Anglo-Saxons, while Vignola and Serlio are for the rest. For the Central European architecture is the expansion, and if there is interesting, one day we can talk a little bit more about Vignola. What happens when the architecture that you do is not the French Beaux-Arts? Because, for example, I think we were talking about that in the comments in the last class about the Spanish architectural education, that in the end of century, in the 1890s and the early 1900s, the professors in Madrid and Barcelona would complain that their students were copying the modernist fashions coming from Paris, whilst ignoring the true principles of Spanish architecture. And these people are not talking about modernism as Art Nouveau. Remember that in Catalonia and in Spain, what everywhere else called Art Nouveau, in Spanish it's called modernismo, which always causes confusion when compared with the English modernism. But no, this is talking about the Beaux-Arts architecture, the grandiose Beaux-Arts architecture that is coming to, that the students are seeing, because they see magazines, they go to Paris, and we will talk a bit more about Paris. That's what they see. So that was that. And as opposed to the Beaux-Arts, and we will talk about the middle part of the slide in a moment, you had the regionalisms. So that is like as opposed to that centralized model that was emanating from Paris to everywhere else, each region, each other country who didn't want to embrace that French model would find their own regional or national expression that will go as big or small as necessary as the country would prefer. And then it would be regional. So, for example, if we go to Spain, that would be a regional architecture from north, a regional architecture from the south. But at the same time, there is a perception that there is a more national architecture that could be identified as the architecture of the capital, or the architecture in Madrid and the surroundings of Madrid, which is the very severe renaissance of the late 16th century. And on that regard, you could perceive that which is the proper Italian architecture. And in many cases, it has become more the Tuscan architecture. The Tuscany has become more as the representative of the Italian architecture, as opposed to Rome or to Milan or to Venice. No, Venice is Venice. Everyone identifies Venice with Italy, but everyone would probably identify better like a Tuscan house or Tuscan villa would be more identified as properly Italian. The same way that if we see a typical Bavarian or house from the Black Forest, we say this looks German. So, or to the point, even if you go to Strasbourg, if we are in France, we would feel that it looks more German than French. So that was what's happening when as the sort of opposition to the Beaux-Arts. And what happened? That there would be people, architects, who would be formally trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition, because all the academies would copy the model either from the École des Beaux-Arts or from the École Polytechnique in Paris. The model, the copied model would be French, but at the same time, they would develop their own preference or their own style, their own speciality, own regional styles. And that was something that for historians and for people who were trying to classify all that was unmissable, was not acceptable. If I am putting every architect on a label, on a single label, if this gentleman was doing Beaux-Arts and South or Occitan regional, how am I going to classify? I don't want to put two options because then I have to duplicate the index, and then people are going to think I'm not accurate. Is one or another? Okay, I put him eclectic because he did two. He was a specialist in doing two. And then from all that mare magnum of eclecticism, the modernists would end up selecting a bunch of heroes. We're going to see some of them today that would become the precursors. Why? Because they say so. For example, Otto Wagner, we're going to see one word from Otto Wagner and to see where is the modernism in Otto Wagner. Here, no matter how much, no, yeah, he used aluminium. Okay, fine, yeah, everyone knew about aluminium and other materials. It's not that they were banning them to be used. As opposed to that, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, you had what we call the Edwardian Baroque, and something that I love this word because it's like a nice punch, is the Renaissance. So it's mixing the word Renaissance and Ren. Christopher Wren was one of the most famous British architects. He did St. Paul's Cathedral and many, many other buildings, the Greenwich Hospital, and many other buildings across UK. Very creative, powerful creativity. And then, I mean, when at the end of 19th century, they want to express the glory of the empire, because by the 1890s, the British Empire was reaching the peak of its prosperity. Then they wanted to show a new imperial architecture, and that expression was Christopher Wren, because it was the only Baroque architect they could um, they could use as a reference, because it was the only one doing big buildings big enough, and they didn't want to go for the Georgian architect because despite having been done, because it was perceived as too simple, too strict, too practical, too functional. So it's very interesting, all those criteria, and you needed something more representative, and we will see some examples. So on that sense, I mean, I could show thousands of buildings, but one I wanted to show is the department store as an example of how these architects adopted architecture from other times to express a new need. And the department store was something that didn't exist until the late 1860s. This was one of the first one, Marshall Field Store in Chicago by Henry Hobson Richardson. This one is a generation prior, this generation of last masters. So he was one of the professors, one of the mentors of this last generation. And I always say that if you want to know, if you want to use Romanesque, if you want to find inspiration in Romanesque, the architect you need to look at is Henry Hobson Richardson. I always say that he did more for Romanesque than Romanesque itself in terms of of a tool for inspiration. So Richardson is quite, I mean, this department store, unfortunately, has disappeared. Is quite an interesting thing to visit. Well, not to visit, to see, to visit them mentally, and to find inspiration with. It's a very simple architecture with rusticated stone, a very simple cornice, and the sequence of arches is quite interesting. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have the very first European one, Le Bon Marché. In France, there is even a novel, The Paradise, inspired in this building, in what was being sold in this building. And many of the techniques, I mean, obviously, we now in 2025, we are in a obvious decadence of the retail and challenging times for retail. But everything we knew about retail, everything we have been experiencing about retail, even still nowadays, and what was normal even before the pandemic, had its origins in what people were doing at Le Bon Marché, Marshalls, Fear and Scott, Harrods in London that settled also a standard. Both Le Bon Marché and Harrods settled the standard of the department store, a store where you could go and buy everything from all over the world at the best quality, and but also at a competitive price. So, but it's not only about Harrods or Le Bon Marché. I mean, this is the elevation of Harrods. I mean, this is an Edwardian, this is a properly Edwardian building, as you can see. And but back in time, I mean, by the early 20th century, it was getting a bit obsolete, a bit out of date because of the ways the goods were sold. And then Selfridges came. Harry Selfridges uh, took what he had been learning in the United States and he brought it to UK and adopted to the market. And I would say that everything that Selfridges invented, or everything we know, as I've said before, that all that the retail was based on Le Bon Marché and on Harrods, but the way we perceive retail today, even the online retail, is based on what Harry Gordon Selfridges did in his shop. So the concept of sale, the concept of the famous motto, the client is always right, giving your money back or giving your money back with a boucher, all that was created by Selfridges. The concept of having a restaurant or a cafe inside the shopping mall, offering you food, offering you beauty products. Selfridges was the first one that you enter now in any department store. What do you have at the entrance? The perfumes. Selfridges was the first one in putting the perfumes there. And he was doing it in a building like that. That's, I mean, if you are a modernist and you hate classicism, so this is totally out of date. He was not in the spirit of his time, blah, blah, blah. Selfridges has elevators, Selfridges has escalators, Selfridges had internal lighting, Selfridges had a telephone department. They had even something called the Department of Research, which where they could call anyone could go and ask them to find something, and they would find it for them. So the the um, the architecture of Selfridges is it's quite remarkable in that sense. The scale is more French than English. Even when you're in Oxford Street and you see it, it doesn't look like properly English, but it's a beautiful example of all this Edwardian Baroque and the Renaissance. And here you can see a glimpse of the elevation and how everything is very well engaged, wonderful four-fronted Ionic capitals and an attic, and then how all the whole base, the pedestal of the columns, if you want to say so, is acting as the windows. And Selfridges as well was pioneering in doing window shopping, in the window shopping display in the window, sorry, meaning that they would attract the clientele by creating wonderful displays, while other shops they were having just more discreet, just merchandise, just show the merchandise in an orderly manner, as if you were in a you go to any farmer's market and you see all the apples very well displayed, orderly displayed, and the origins. So that was it was done, and Selfridges started to do in a more creative way. So that's what I'm putting here, that the shopping malls, because you are norm you will be, when you read about them, and there is a massive polemics in London about a building that is very close to Selfridges that was built in the 1930s for Mac and Spencer, that they want to demolish it because it has no interest, because back in the time people didn't do that already, no. But the thing is that there it is done. And just to warn all of you that we are living in a bit of erasing of the story of the 19 of architectural story of the 1920s and 30s, because it was never classified as interesting, because the modernists could never admit that what for them were the formative years were not they didn't have the preeminence that they had in the 50s. So they couldn't admit that. So that's why you hardly find any of these buildings are listed or protected. And that's why you see wonderful buildings from the 1910s, 20s, 30s being destroyed and demolished impudently or without any blink, because they're not protected. And it's because of that. It's because the hatred to see that all the other alternatives were still popular except in theirs. So that's also things that you need to consider again when we're talking about restoration and conservation, and we will talk about them. But again, this is not only about London and about but this is Edinburgh. This is Jenner's. This was an institution in Edinburgh until very recently. It was the Harrods of Scotland. Basically, it was a wonderful department store. Anything you could imagine was sold there, including furniture, including whole interiors. They were pioneers in selling whole interiors for all the newly built country houses in Scotland, for all the people from England who were going to buy houses in Scotland, using the easiness of transport that they could now actually spend a relatively comfortable summer in Scotland. They would buy all these interiors in Jenners, and they would be shipped everywhere to Scotland. And this is the inside of the department store, a wonderful department store. Now it's under hybrid restoration by David Chipperfield, but fortunately, because it's very well listed, apparently it's going to be very well protected. So we cross fingers to see something like this after the restoration. But yeah, so that you can see, I mean, there was a variety of things. No, if we have to classify this elevation of the Jenners, how would you classify it? Or if we go to Selfridges, how do you classify Selfridges other than classical or neoclassical? And that what was creating all this headache to all these PT historians, all these late Victorian, Edwardian, all these 19th century people who were inheritors of the Illustration, that thought that history, architecture, and art could be classified as easily as Linneo was classifying every single living being. No, they thought that if every living being has a scientific name, every artistic work should have a scientific name to be ascribed to, so a label. And then that's where they started the word eclecticism. Initially was to define those they couldn't label, but in a negative way. No, it's like this is unclassificable, and I'm going to put eclectic, and then anything that is not a puristic thing, it will be that hybrid. Because remember also that we're in the time of the eugenics, we're in the time of racism, we're in the times of all this ethnicism, in which no each ethnic has a specific way of behaving, etc. And they had to do the same with architects and architecture. If you were an architect who was doing Scottish baronial, you couldn't do something like that, because the Scottish baronial was much shorter building. So that's a 4-story building, and you should have done something like Harrods. But what's Harrods? No, I don't know. So that's a bit the problem. They were expecting that everyone should be doing Italian palazzos, Florentine palazzos or Roman palazzos, imitations of Palazzo Farnese, or in the best case scenario, following Haussmann. So people who were not doing that, they would be ascribed onto that, and then the ball was growing. But as I was saying, I mean, technology was there. I mean, we are normally told that there was no technology, that all these people were still living in 18th century, that they knew nothing. And I mean, it comes to mind. I don't know if any of you have heard the song. I am I am the perfect. I am the perfect model of a modern Major General from the Pirates of Penzance. It's a very funny song. I recommend all of you to take a look at it on YouTube, of the song of the Major General. And the Major General said that he's a specialist in everything, but his knowledge of war stops in the Napoleonic Wars. He does, and the opera is supposed to happen at the beginning of 20th century. So that's the image that they were having about all these people, that they were sending about all these eclectic architects, that they were too worried on ornamentation, they knew nothing about technology. But here you go, we had books were explaining you how to design a lift and a staircase around the lift. And these lifts obviously were designed based on the carrying chair, portable chairs, and portable enclosed chairs that were very popular in the 18th century. They would be inspired in carriages, because same way that the primitive um, rail coaches would be inspired in carriages, and the primitive cars were inspired in carriages. So what I wanted you to take with here is that this book, which is from the early 20th century, had that was a focus on technology. That was the idea that technology had to be included in the buildings. It was not only about ornament. It was not only about beauty. And this is important to see, because nowadays all our movement of traditional architecture has this thing of only beauty matters, and then someone else will put the structure, and then we complain when the engineers come and don't want to use a stone because they don't know how to use it. These people would use a stone because both engineers and architects would know how the stone works, would know how iron works. It is important to acknowledge the technical component of all this and not just stop on the pretty design or the pretty drawing. And talking about that, design and drawing, how was the education back then? How did these architects get educated? Because the architects that we're going to see at the end of the lecture, they were born the 1830s, 1850s, and they were very old in the 1910s, 1920s, but they were active. They were doing things still in the 1920s. And these old people who were supposed to be like the most against change, etc., they were pretty much aware of everything that was going on. And they were about cinema, they were aware of radio, they were aware of telephones, and that all those things had to be integrated in the house, electricity, etc. But the architects that we will be talking next week, which are the architects who were born around the 1870s, so they were architects who were born at the beginning of the Belle Epoque, they learned with this last generation of classicists. So how was the model? We talk a little bit about the model in Spain, and the model in Spain can be extended to most of the countries who couldn't afford following the proper French system. And actually, the only country who could probably afford, to a very distorted way, and a copy of the French system was United States. And we will talk a little bit on what they did, and it didn't work very well. But the French École des Beaux-Arts, the French had two places to learn architecture. You had the École des Beaux-Arts, which was heavily focused on creativity and design and style, and you had the École Polytechnique, which was more focused on technicalities. In practical terms, that would mean that if you were graduating from the École Polytechnique, you will be probably working for the army. You will be probably working in a provincial town doing small things. If you were graduating in the École des Beaux-Arts, that means that you would be probably working, would either A, become a glorious French architect. Your commissions would be much luxurious building, what we could now high end. No, that's what they would be. That's what they would be doing. They would be doing competition. They would be probably the only ones to be admitted in competitions to design big official buildings. And the education of these students was interesting, because you remember when we were talking about Spain that normally the orders and the principles of classical architecture wouldn't be taught. You would have to learn them at home. And the French never had a proper structured study of architecture, but the academy was issuing the title of architect to people who would demonstrate that they have the knowledge according to the academics in the committee. So what would those academics in the committee do? So if your teacher, if your professor is going to examine you, you have a chance that your professor will probably tell you things that are going to enter into the exam. I remember I had this is a funny story. I remember I had a professor at Sevilla, very conservative, very, 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 very conservative of that generation, if you know what I mean. And we had this the subject was urban management. And the subject had its topics that is has it like curriculum, but when you were going to class, what he was talking about was about how Madrid grew, period, and how Madrid was good, Barcelona was bad. That was his resume of the whole class. The theoretical classes for the practical classes, it was different type of thing. He was like a strict urbanist with the manual. So it was very good because you learn the whole code because he would get your project and tell you this, and this doesn't comply regulation. Anyway, this professor would have its own, he would teach, he would speak about his own thing. And then when you go to the exam, if you had gone to classes, you know what he was going to ask you. If you haven't gone to classes, you haven't seen his notes, then you would do something else. That's what was happening in the academy. Some of the academics would teach young students to provide their to know Blondel was the most famous one, but Boulez in his old age would also teach. And I'm putting Boulez because a lot of you, when you listen about Boulez, you imagine the cenotaph of Newton, the library, which by the way is the image that appears in our channel of the library of the Salon, is his proposal for the library. But Boulez does all those drawings when he's an old retired person. I think that's important for you to know that because when people, especially Kaufman, talks about Boulez, he's only talking about his drawings, and Boulez was a revolutionary because he was doing the cenotaph of Newton, and he forgets and he omits that Boulez was a very successful developer in the second half of 18th century, and he died rich, forgotten but rich, and forgotten even by the revolution. So it wasn't like Ledoux, who was prosecuted by the revolution, but Boulez wasn't. So he was so old that people forgot about him. And then his building disappeared under Haussmann. So that's why the only testimonies that we have about Boulez are his drawings, but that doesn't mean that that was the only thing he did. I'm putting it as a side note for you to understand a bit more about Boulez and about all these things about Boulez, Ledoux, Loger, Durand, all of them being the precursor of modernism, which is just, and excuse my French, bullshit that Emil Kaufman invents. So, coming back to the École des Beaux-Arts, you would go to get some theoretical lectures about history, about materials, etc., but you wouldn't have design subjects. What you would have is, as to pass every course, you had to present small competitions. And what do you learn? How to draw. There would be the ateliers. These ateliers would be either um, financed or directed by one professor at the École des Beaux-Arts, or B, by a practitioner architect. However, if you were a practitioner architect, you would have two ateliers. You would have the atelier for the students, which is basically you were giving them a room for them to draw whatever they wanted. And then you would get from there, the best ones, you would employ them. And what did the students do in their room? They would draw and they would prepare for competitions. And then the younger ones would help the older ones to finish the drawings. So there was a hierarchy where the younger, the less experienced were helping the more experienced to finalize the drawings for the small competitions. And those prizes were sometimes money, sometimes were diplomas, sometimes were excursions or grants. And the big one was the Prix of Rome. So people will go to Rome to study. And we're going to see some of the images. I mean, this is the courtyard of the École des Beaux-Arts when you could teach sculpture and architecture there. So you could see the model at 1-to-1 of the Parthenon, lots of sculpture, a lot of inspiration For that, a lot of the things disappeared. They were destroyed in May 68. Unfortunately, something similar was in Santiago de Cuba, and all that was destroyed in 1948. They just smashed all the plaster cast to the point in which most of the universities up until the 1940s and 50s, they would have massive collections of plaster casts, and all of them disappeared. Some of them were literally destroyed or just disposed away, like because they were considered out of interest, or they would be destroyed by the students in revolts. I remember, for example, in the school of Sevilla, which was a modernist building, they had at the end of a corridor, they had a sculpture of St. George from Donatello. And there was a student strike, and some bright sparks, the only thing they could imagine to do was to smash down the sculpture, chop the head, and then just go with the head stick on a stick just around, just protesting. I mean, I remember the professor who brought the sculpture to because those were part of the common things that the university had. I remember that professor was very strict, very rude. He started to cry because, I mean, come on, you had the opportunity to see the St. George of Donatello every single day, the privilege of seeing that, and now because you're angry with other professors, you are smashing it and destroying it. It's like when they destroyed the Venus in front of the mirror of Velázquez just because the suffragettes were not getting the 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 um, the vote, or when all these crazy people just throw paint on top of all the painting just to protest against climate change or the likes. And this is how it looks like. Some of them have survived, but a lot of them were literally destroyed in May 1968 as part of all this cultural revolution. To know more about how things were in the École des Beaux-Arts, this is a very good book called The Architecture of the École des Beaux-Arts. It was an exhibition done in the 1970s in New York and then expanded into a book. It's a 600-page book, very good. It still can be found at a reasonable price at second hand. So if you can find it, I recommend you. You can download only the catalog of the exhibition, which is like 15, 20 pages, still very interesting. So if you have the opportunity, you just type this name and it will appear you in one of the first or second search. And these are pictures of the ateliers. So we know what the students were there. And as you can see, I mean, they were having fun. It was not a serious place. So you can see that they are like doing some silly faces. These two guys are one sitting on top of the other. This one has his hands crossed. This one is lying down. They were having fun. They were fun places. They were all young men having fun, drawing, learning. The younger helping the older, everyone helping each other. It was very collaborative. It was not hierarchical. And you can see there architecture atelier Pauline. So this Pauline was an architect who was paying the local or the premise for them to go and draw. And then he would go several times per week, give some advice to the students. And then when he saw that someone was being good, he would say, "Oh, do you want to come to my office and work for me?" So for some students, it would be a waste of time because the parents would be paying the money. For students who were poor, it was a blessing that Monsieur Pauline would go and offer them a position. We have another one here. This looks a bit more fun. And you can see, I mean, this is one of the things when you say, "Oh, why people were so serious in the past?" And I hope that the algorithm doesn't say anything when I point out this, but I want you to very discreetly look at this. So this is early 20th century. So people, boys will be boys, as they say. No, yeah, everyone draws a dick at any point. So it's what I mean. I mean, they were having fun. They were fun spaces for them to work. And there is another one, the last one here. Again, you can. This was in the outside. They managed to take out some of the sculptures, and look, they put some hats on them. So they were having fun. So don't think about that. The ateliers were places to have fun, to collaborate, to work together. They were not, and we will see a little bit what happened in the United States, that they were spaces for learning. They were like a camaraderie that didn't exist in the classroom or in the formal atelier. If you were working, you were working. You had to be serious. There was a place for fun. And what was the reward at the end? The maximum reward was staying here for at least 1 year in Villa Medici in Rome, learning from the principles of Roman architecture. This would be the peak. So those who were getting the prix of Rome, they were the elite of the architects. And then when they would come back, they could either enter even straight away as partners in one architectural office, or create their own office if they had contacts enough, or go to the provinces and open their own office, which was always like a guarantee of success, because the mayor would straight away and tell you, okay, I want you to do the new library or the new infirmary, etc. And all the local elites would go to you because you won the Grand Prix of Rome. So the ateliers were hard. They were fun, but they were hard, but they were very rewarding. So in the 1860s, some Americans go to the atelier, to France, and they learn at the atelier, and they have a lot of fun, and then they want to implement that in the United States. So this is a photograph of those who won the prize. Note, there was no women. I think in France they were much later. I think in Spain, you start having, late 19th century, you start having doctorates and graduates, etc. But in France, it would take a little bit more of time. Now, to know about what happened in the United States, I have this book, which I have recommended all the time, The Struggle for Modernism, which is basically the history of the School of Architecture at Harvard. It's very good. And it also explains you how the atelier system never worked in the United States, and also how the Americans copied to exaggeration the French model, to the point in which they took it to so much perfection, they perfected it so much that it was impossible to change, because it was too perfect, too refined. Any change would involve a radical change. And that's what happened. By the 1930s, the whole atelier system, which in France had been evolving, in the United States, it evolved very quickly in the 1880s and 90s. It became just constrained with all these wonderful analytics that we still can see. And then it was impossible to evolve because it didn't grow, they didn't leave space for growing. And therefore it just became stuck. And then that's when Gropius is invited to help them to make some tweaks to the program. And Gropius said that the only way he's going to help is if they let him impose his program, which is basically how modernism started in Harvard. So it is important to repeat and to know this story, because sometimes why it happened, why, no? This is the way it happened. The Americans killed the Beaux-Arts system out of success. So they make it so successful that they just died of success. And then Gropius, the only thing that needed to do was just to put the nail on the coffin. So that's that is what you need to consider on this. But I think that the good news is that there is a group of people that have recovered the atelier tradition, and they're in Trondheim. They are Norwegians in Trondheim, and they have recovered. They started last year, and they have created their own space separated from the university, and they meet and they teach each other classical architecture, and they learn, they do counter proposals, and they are very active because Norway is not a very big country, so it's easy to create some digital imprint, and they are becoming relevant, and they are settling an example. I mean, one of them was one of my students last year at the Classic Planning Academy, and he did wonderful works. I'm sure that you will see it very soon on social media. But yeah, that's the thing. The association is called Acanthus, but basically they are a modern atelier. It's sort of inspiration, and this is one of the works that came from one of them. He had been here in the past, in one of the past sessions of the Salon, he had come here to us to show us his work, and we have been working and correcting on the free critique. So that's what I always tell everyone: come and bring your free critique. We will be very happy to help you. This is a lovely building that he has designed, and at the same time that this fits the neoclassical tradition, is purely Norwegian. So let's talk about this last generation of classicists. Without no order, the only one that, let's say, it's going to matter is the one we're going to talk at the end, because we're going to keep talking about him. But all these are inspiration for you to know about them, to read about them, because again, this generation of architects were formed in the pure classical tradition. By the age, they were formed in a world, or they studied in a world that didn't have much technology, but they had to adapt technology during their flourishing years. They had to adapt to a lot of things. And these gentlemen, McKee, Met and White, were like one of the biggest firms in architecture in the United States. They settled example for the quite glorious classical tradition. They were the same way that Hegeman and Pitts are the architects, are the urbanists of the City Beautiful movement. McKee, Met and White, together with Carrier and Hastings, are the architects of the City Beautiful movement. And again, I mean, people normally put them, boom, onto eclectics because they were so versatile that they could do anything. So that's important for you to consider. No, I mean, on McKee, Met and White, they were eminently classical, but they also played with other styles, more French, more. And when I say classical, I mean the American version of the Renaissance. So McKee, Met and White were William Rutherford Mead, Charles Fuller McKee, and Stanford White. They were a trio of architects. They were a successful firm. And yeah, I mean, the two of them had a very anodyne life. And the last one, Stanford White, was a womanizer, ended up, he died while in a swing. If you want to know more, search on the internet. So just to see that the Victorians and the Edwardians were they were having more fun than you think. And these were the architects of Pennsylvania Station. They unfortunately disappeared Pennsylvania Station in New York. That is one of the most wonderful buildings ever built. And it's a perfect example of how to take a typology from antiquity, which is the Roman baths of Caracalla or the Roman baths of Diocletian, and convert it into the waiting room for a train station. So this is looking backwards 2,000 years in the past and bring them forward to a new technology. This is very important. So that's what people see this. Oh, yeah, these people were so old. They couldn't see forward. They could only look at the past. No, on the contrary. They were looking more forward than many others. Why? Because once they demolish Pennsylvania Station, when they have been changing buildings every 30 years. Who has? Still, the building by McKee, Met and White has been standing there more time than the 2 or 3 buildings that replace it. Who was looking forward, who was looking backward, who was only looking for presentism? That's very important as well to ask yourself and to consider when you see critics on this architecture. This one architecture that was taken from the past to the present and the future, and that's important to consider. And of course, if you want to know more about McKee, Met and White, the 5 volumes of his monography, including plenty of plans, elevations, sections, and details, is in archive.org, available for you for free. The other one, which were the competitors, is Carrier and Hastings. They were the other firm, they're the massively important firm that did the New York Central Library. And again, I mean, this is something that it's purely classical, but it's not Italian, it's not Georgian. And if you say American, you don't say it American, but you don't say it French. It was a genuinely classicist system that I think works very well for big urban spaces, because many times we have discussed in channels, in private conversations, that classical architecture can be very boring because it's very repetitive. But classical architecture, well done, has its own ways of enhancing itself. And Carrier and Hastings and McKee, Met and White did that in a majestic way. I put here in the middle of the selection one that it's a bit you don't know very well. I mean, well, everyone knows about him. It's that why is Otto Wagner here? He's a precursor of modernism. He's just the first Viennese modernist, blah blah blah. The times of Freud and the cocaine, blah blah blah. And Wagner was modernist. Are you sure that Wagner was modernist? Have you seen his synagogue? Very classical. Have you seen all the buildings that he did in his first stage? Or Karlsplatz, because he used marble cladding. I say everyone was using marble cladding. Marble is very expensive. You don't use marble blocks. That's the theory. And yeah, it's true that Wagner was part of the secession, and he was very creative, and he did very wonderful buildings that could be difficult to ascribe into classicism if you look at them formally, because he was trying to look for something different and something new. And we will talk a little bit about that at the end. But I wanted to bring here the postal bank in Vienna, because this is normally considered because he started using aluminum for these profiles and this porte cochere and the bolts that he used to secure the stone for the cladding. And everyone sees here a precursor of modernity. While the only thing that you could say that, yeah, he used the big bolts because he wanted to create an effect on the facade that were present anyway in other earlier works of him. But all these buildings had a porte cochere. I think that the only difference is that Wagner wanted to use a more shiny aluminum while everyone was using painted cast iron. So there was an experimentation on materials, but this experimentation on material doesn't mean that because you're using a new material, you have to do something completely new. So he was experimenting, and Wagner and many others, they did that, but you have here a very complete symmetry. You have a hierarchy of openings. Everything you see here, it's a properly classical building. And when you see the plan, you have the same idea. It's a perfectly symmetrical building with monumental staircases, a great hall. So even Wagner lived on the classical tradition, and that's what he produced. And even something that you could consider, again, all these precursors of modernism, the secession, it was a secession, it was an independence from a more strict Beaux-Arts. It was a reaction against the French Beaux-Arts trying to look about for something genuinely Viennese. And that's in the context you have to see it. It was an alternative or a response towards a more unifying uh, international Beaux-Arts style. It was part of the regional reaction against the otherwise the omnipresence of the Beaux-Arts architecture. Because at the end of the day, the cultural preeminence of France meant also that the Beaux-Arts architecture was an architecture that could be exported. And we have I don't know if Roberto is here, Roberto Galan, but he talks very well about all the aspirational component of classical architecture. And that's what the Beaux-Arts architecture has, because it's telling you the Frenchness, the elite, the grandeur of that architecture. Aston Webb, again, I mean, see, he was born in 1849, died in 1930, so very long life. But also, I mean, it's like people would say a Victorian architect with zero creativity. That's what, boom, all of with just very quickly, he's just dismissed as that, or a grumpy grandpa like Blomfield, as we will see. So Aston Webb design, among other things, in this portrait, you can see some of these buildings in the background. It's basically the whole facade of the Victorian Albert Museum facing to Cromwell Road. He designed it in a completely mix of Baroque and a bit of Jacobean styles, and that's where he thrived on that. But he also did the facade of Buckingham Palace, because when you go to Buckingham Palace today, this is how Buckingham Palace was looking in 1890, and this is how it looks today. So Aston Webb completely redesigned the facade of Buckingham Palace to give it this. It's what we were talking before about getting rid of all of a more Victorian, a bit more domestic, and a bit more scaled architecture. This was directly inspired on the Italian palazzo with some English additions, with some sort of Jacobean addition. This is basically the Palazzo Farnese, and he created something completely new, something purely neoclassical, purely English, purely Palladian to some sense. And this is part of the important. This generation was doing all these extremely creative things, and they are usually told to us that these people were doing nothing. They were just boring people. And by the way, recently Francis Terry did some amendments to the facade, thinking that the facade wasn't actually enough, and it should have a little bit more of fun. I don't know what you think about it. Uh, it's it's an alternative as any other. He has some valid points, like hiding all these windows here with the festoons. But you're hiding a lot of windows, a lot of spaces there. The cupolas look interesting, but I don't know how well they would work, with the whole elevation. But it is a nice attempt. If we had to say, let's renew Buckingham Palace, it could be a good renovation project. And also see the nod. These little elements are a bit of a nod to the little elements that were here in the site 100 years ago. And last but not least, we're going to see a couple more, but I want you to take this gentleman with his pipe and his mustache. Reginald Blomfield is going to be our little hero of the whole season, because Reginald Blomfield, he was working with Norman Shaw. We will see next week about Norman Shaw a little bit, and all his flaws. He was a bit of a funny architect. He was, yeah, I think he was one of these ones that was never in full capacities at work for drinking reasons. I don't know if it was one of was James Wyatt. So sorry if I am. I no, sorry. I think that was James Wyatt, who also had the tendency of fighting with the fist with his clients. But yeah, apparently Norman Shaw had his flaws, and Blomfield was the other one solving the problems. And Blomfield eventually, all of you have been in London. If you haven't been in London, you all know Piccadilly. Blomfield is the architect who did all Piccadilly. Piccadilly and the beginning of Regent Street, Eyre Street, which for me is the most interesting street in London, the Piccadilly Hotel, which is very nice at several levels, and we will see it, an amazing Edwardian pool, which we will see in the next week. And he was very convinced architect of the values and virtues of the classical tradition, as opposed to a more wider, let's mix and match. He was a good, very knowledgeable person. He knew about everything. He wrote books about everything. He was a good connoisseur of French architecture, and that precisely put him in an advantage to others who were just looking and getting inspiration, graphic inspiration or visual inspiration from the French. That allowed Blomfield to be able to discern and say, okay, this is good from French tradition, I don't like this from French tradition, I take it out. He was also doing it in a sort of very eugenic way. The French tend to be like this. The Germans tend to do this, tend to have the eyes on this color, and therefore they do this, etc. He was this type of guy. But he wrote very interesting books. His book about gardening, which we discuss when we talk in the session about gardening, was very interesting. And I recommend to all of you, just watch my old video on that if you want to know more. But yeah, Blomfield he was also the first architect to propose a theoretical framework against modernism. Almost the only one. He was the only one who saw the threat of modernism, while the others thought it was just a fashion, a waning fashion. Blomfield was worried that it couldn't be. Blomfield knew that these people were setting a theoretical framework against them. And Blomfield tried to fight them with ideas, not only because everyone thought that the quality of their work would just be enough for modernism just to pass away, but it wasn't. So Blomfield was a precursor. He was the last true theorist of classicism, I would say, before before just in postmodernity, new theoreticals or new theoreticians appeared, and there was a rediscovery of tradition, and tradition was reformulated to, but Blomfield spoke from tradition, and that's what it is important for you. And we're going to be in the next session of the Salon, as I said, we're going to be discussing the book Modernismus, which a lot of you probably have started to read. And if not, I encourage you to start reading it, and we will be discussing it because it's a very interesting book. Every page can give you 10 other pages of notes. You can so read it with care, read it with slowly, tasting every word, because every sentence is a reference to something else. So if you read it continuously, you get the idea. But if you have a second reading, say, oh, what is he talking about this building? And then you find that there is a very interesting building. Who is this Robertson he's talking about? And then you find that it's actually it was a classical architect that converted into modernism, and so on and so on. And just to finalize, a couple of examples of this so-called eclecticism. The Palace of Post, the Palacio de Correos in Mexico City, from Adamo Boari, who was an Italian architect building in Mexico, who was getting inspired in the Spanish plateresco style, which was the transition between Gothic and Renaissance. And all these PT historians trying to classify this building, they would have expected that an Italian would do something Italian in Mexico or something Mexican in Mexico, whatever these historians thought that Mexican architecture was. And then all of a sudden, we have an Italian who is doing something completely unexpected, but which matches perfectly well with the general environment of the moment. And that's what you need to perceive. There was a feeling that a lot of things were possible, and there was a feeling that there was a precise style for everything, and that you had, and the more that you mastered, the merrier. The more that you knew about different things, the more possibilities you could have to design something successful. And that was something that, again, those PT minds that were classifying everything would assume easily. And just to finalize, if you see this name, Adolfo Morales de los Rios, we're talking about a Spanish guy, very Spanish, from Sevilla. He studied in Paris and then came back to Spain and did this, the Gran Teatro Falla in Cádiz. You cannot go more Spanish than this. Do you know what this guy did? He went to Brazil. He became super famous and successful career in Brazil. He never came back to Spain. And a lot of buildings in Rio de Janeiro, this is the Museo Nacional in Rio de Janeiro, were done by him in a French style in Brazil. And I know that Brazilians are, I don't know if we have Brazilians today, but I know that you listen to the canal, that we discuss a lot in your Brazilian group about this, and you always are thinking that there is nothing in Brazil, that all tradition was erased, and all of a sudden you have a guy from Sevilla going there and building wonderful buildings in the French tradition, linking Brazil with Europe, bringing the vocation of the French haute couture, high culture, sorry, not high tailoring, high culture into Brazil, because Brazil was a powerful country. Brazil was an European country because it had heavy links with Europe. So this is the architecture. This is what the last generation of proper classicists were doing. There was no boring architecture. There was an international movement. People were moving around and doing a lot of things like this one. And now this. Where is this? What do you think this is? I'm going to read the comments because I see that there is plenty of them. Okay. Okay, Netherlands. No, it's not in the Netherlands. No, it's not in England. It's not in New York. It's not in Argentina. Paraguay, no. It's not in America. It's not in Africa either. It is in Asia, but Asia is very big. No, it's in Tokyo. It's by two German architects, German Bockham and Hermann Ende. It's part of the efforts of the architecture of the major restoration to identify with Europe. Because you know that in Japan, they have been living a feudal period since 16th, a sort of recession to hyper-feudalism, the shogunate, from the early 17th century up until the mid 19th century. And then they were living in perfect isolationism. So anyone arriving to Japan was killed, no questions asked. So nobody could enter, nobody could leave. Everyone was okay with that. Only the Dutch could trade a little bit in Sejima, just a trading post. They couldn't leave the trading post. And eventually, at some point, the Americans come with gunboats and they say, either you trade or we bomb you. Fine. And the Japanese said, okay, we trade. And then, yeah, all of a sudden, they send an embassy around Europe, and they start realizing that they want, because Japan was rich by then because it had a lot of centuries of accumulated wealth. So it industrialized very quickly, and it converted in less than 20 years from the major restoration. It becomes a completely westernized, well, not completely, but it becomes a westernized country in politics, fashion changes. I mean, and it collides with so people will still wearing the kimonos, etc., but they will come back with the frocks, the crinolines, and the hats and the architecture. And all this architecture will be brought because the emperor will bring European institutions to govern the country, and that's the way it would go. And that's I mean that is this is part of that architecture. I mean, some architects, when you see all this original, say, oh yeah, it was no creativity, they denied everything, etc. I think this is brilliant that all of a sudden the emperor of Japan is deciding to implement this architecture because he wants to modernize his country, and at the same time keep the tradition. Because, and this will leave for another lecture, it is very interesting what happened in Japan in all these years, because on one side they had a fascination from Europe, but at the same time they want to keep their own tradition, and they have a very interesting dialectic happening all the time, because all of a sudden they realize that they have a wonderful tradition, wonderful crafts, but their architecture is unable to do big things because they are a culture of little things, pretty little things. And then all of a sudden they need to face big things and they don't know how. So that's why they embrace European culture for the big things and they keep Japanese culture for the small things. So with this, we have finished all this. I mean, as a conclusion, 1870 to 1914 was a period of extraordinary creativity. Students and architects had a strong classicist education, but they also mastered medieval, Islamic, and Orientalist architecture. Eclecticism wasn't a random mix, but a strict selection. And ornament, allegories, and symbolism were very important. People knew what things meant. People knew what things were meaning. And once you understand that, is when you can read all this. It's just not ornaments. It's telling you a story. And despite the term nowadays, the term now is pejorative. It's as a result of the post-style war debate. No, the moment you couldn't assign a single style to a single architect, you put them on the eclecticism because you don't know. But at the same time, and this is a side note because it will need another lecture, another debate, another whole season to do with the Art Nouveau, the Secession, the Junge style. What alternatives? And many architects work on both. They still use the high Beaux Arts tradition to build big buildings, representative buildings, and then they would go for the Art Nouveau, Junge style, and regional style for smaller things or things that had to be more related to the place in which they were settling. And before we enter into the question and answers, I just want to do some announcement and miscellanea of things. I think that that all of you should be aware now. If not, there you go. There is a Inbound Congress, Progress in Tradition, from the 22nd to the 24th of October in London. If you apply, the Congress will be broadcasted online. I don't know if Michael Hadida is here today, but he will be the person doing the broadcasting for everyone. So if you register to watch it online, you will be able to watch it online. It will be available as well on on post production, the same way as the Beauty and Ugliness was. And there will be activities on the 22nd, visits. I will be, for those of you coming, if you haven't done so yet, and you want to, I will be doing a tour through to the Victorian Albert Museum on the 22nd in the evening. So you just need to register. If you are registered on the Inbound Congress, you just know your interest, and then Harriet will put you on the list. If you have bought your ticket and you haven't bought that option and you still want to go, please contact the organization or just send me a message, direct message, not write it here in the chat. Don't do it in the chat. And as well, for those of you who are not aware, we are starting a new course on the Classic Planning Academy on the 13th of November. You will learn wonderful things about classical architecture. What you see here is the tip of the iceberg. And this is one of the drawings done by one of our students this year. We just inverted the colors. This is, as usual, you know this image very well. This is what you will see from the webcam, what you will be learning, because the classes are online. And this is another selection of our students' work, mostly the second and third exercises of some of our students when they have been working very hard. And some of you may have watched the jury and public exhibition. If you are interested in watching it, it's available on YouTube. Just go to our channel or ask us for the link, and we will send you the link to it. And now thank you very much. Now I open the debate, so you can unmute yourselves and we can have the debate. So any questions about the whole thing about these precursors, this last generation of true classicists? You can write the question or you can just unmute and talk. No, come on, not everyone at the same time.
Hi, Pablo. Bart here.
Yeah, hello, Bart.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Really, really good.
Thank you.
To get such a thorough overview. I was wondering, I know of a couple of German books that I've had, but they are usually covering German architecture of that time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of a seminal kind of summary of this era? Because I think it's quite hard to find something that really covers, the whole range of this era.
I think it's difficult because the problem is that when people were writing history of architecture, they were writing precisely the basis, because once you well, basically what we know, let me just reframe this way. At the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century, there were a lot of people writing about history of architecture, and they were, and because all those years were the recent times, they forgot to talk about it. And then the next generations, because they only used those manuals and they saw that those people didn't talk about that architecture, they kept not talking about it. And when the modernists arrived on historiography in the 1950s, they just say, you see, nobody wrote about it because this architecture is out of interest. So there is very little as a generic monography to talk. I mean, take, for example, Bannister Fletcher. Obviously, he was writing in 1895. He's not going to write about Edwardian architecture, just to mention one. So I think that a general book, I mean, I don't know a specific case of Germany, but from what I know in English architecture and in Spanish architecture, the only thing you can find is just good monographs. And they have to be like individual architects, someone who has decided to devote a PhD on this architect or this other. And then you have the overview. And then normally They are like have a heavy introduction, heavy bias on modernism, and then it's like, okay, this is what everyone says, and then this is what I have discovered. So that's my intake. You have to go one by one, architect by architect.
I see. Yeah, so maybe that's a good book project actually, perhaps even for the CPI, because
I
I
mean,
really feel this era needs to be covered properly also from the side of classicists. You know, as you said, they try to make them forgotten, and it's really hard to wrap your head around how this era really was like, because it's always narrated from the modernist view.
that's a problem. It is, I mean, I remember, for example, I mean, in the case of Andalusia, that was a very super creative in 1910s, 1920s, all before the exhibition in Sevilla. There was a super creative period. And then it's all dismissed as no, these were just pastiche and kitsch. And then nothing happened until after the 50s. And then when you realize, come on, Sevilla was, curiously enough, one of the few cities during the Spanish Republic that things kept being done because they had the wealth to do it. So it's an interesting thing. I think that now said that, the closest thing you can have is the history of 19th century architecture by David Watkin, but it's 19th century, not 20th century. It's still more complete than most of your 19th century architecture, but that's the thing. I mean, all of them are not. It's a monumental task. It's a monumental task, but it's a good field for many people who want to do research. So, Amar, uh, can European architecture work in places like North Africa? Of course, it can. Um, the thing is that on one side, North Africa has its own architectural tradition, and it has worked quite well. I mean, if you check, for example, the post office in Algiers, the French did quite an interesting mix, especially in Algiers and all the French Algeria. They did quite an interesting mix of mix of French housemanning architecture and art and the tradition of Maghrebi architecture. You have even the Cathedral of Algiers, as far as I can remember, is sort of Islamic looking. I think that you cannot compare. Japan and their effort with the previous, I think, is different because Japan was importing something that was totally new for them. Japan was importing with a specific purpose of modernizing the country. In North Africa, on the other side, you have a constant contact with Northern Europe, with the Christian part of the Mediterranean, and they're having a more convergent evolution. And in post-colonialism, all the countries in North Africa, you can say to certain degree, they all became liberal democracies. Japan is a liberal democracy, of course, but Japan went in 10 years from being a feudal country to a liberal democracy without dropping too much blood. So it was a different situation, and I don't think you can compare them. Also, because the problem that the Japanese found is that their own traditional culture was not fit for the purpose of a full modernization of the country. While I think that the North Africa Arab has had a more contact with the West in such a way that you don't need such a direct imposition. Dr. Buras is asking, what about Geoffrey Scott? Doctor, if you want to talk about Geoffrey Scott, I mean, I don't have the space enough, but I would love if you dedicate some words to him if you want to talk.
Yes, if I may.
Yes, please.
I am reading Reginald Blomfield right now, and he attacks not only the modernists, but also Geoffrey Scott. Geoffrey Scott is a very interesting text. He, in many ways, is prescient, and he might actually be a ramp to the future discourse. He writes against neo-medievalism as the ideal style, which its practitioners have always pushed. And he writes for Baroque as being the highest level style there is, something that we can discuss some other time. But I accept that. There are moments in Baroque that are much higher level than anything else classical. But the interesting thing about Geoffrey Scott is that if you replace the word neo-medieval with the word modernist, his critique becomes a very cogent critique of the failure of modernism. He has 4 fallacies he goes for. I don't remember them offhand, but they're there. Blomfield discusses this, and what I discovered writing my PhD is that when I tried to answer the question, what is modernism? I came across a series of ideas, the standard studio ideas. Some of them have no bearing whatsoever on design. They're, true Christian architecture, true socialist architecture, things of that nature. The idea that a building is supposed to give you an emotion, things like that. Then there are things that do impact the design, but don't tell you what something's going to look like, such as function, geometry, reference to landscape, color, light, etc., etc. And then you have styles that tell you exactly what something's going to look like, although it has been forbidden to speak about that in the modernist world. For us, dealing with real design, it is a very easy handle. But what I really discovered, that all of these modernist concepts were actually 19th century romantic ideas that had occurred in the context of the architectural discourse in the 19th century and were dragged into the modernist supposed discourse, but they were really romantic traditional ideas executed in traditional buildings in the 19th century, mostly 18th to 19th century. And they are probably the largest group of most interesting buildings in the world all around. They may not be the ideals you want to work towards, but they're definitely among the most interesting, if not the most interesting, and there are a lot of them. And our discourse really, I believe, wants to continue that very rich discourse of these romantic ideas. And that is kind of how I hope that Blomfield will take us to something like that in the end of his book. I'm not sure how it ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. It's very interesting, and we have discussed quite a lot, many times, all this relationship between. I mean, we're actually discussing before you arrived about all this dialectic between the northern reaction against classicism during 19th century, that is one of the bases of modernism, and how on this quest of classifying everything and everyone's label on that debate end up turning into the word eclecticism as a pejorative, because it was like, if you are not with me, you are against me, and if I cannot classify you in something that will put you with me or against me, I don't want you at all. So that's quite interesting. So Nicole Vieira has a question. All the professors that had at university in Brazil don't like European-based influences other than Portuguese one, saying they are out of context. How could we challenge that perspective? Well, I think that on one side, I always say that at university, you smile and nod, you get your title and run. If you want to pass your subject, you don't challenge your professor. I'm sorry, Federico and Pedro, if you're here listening. So on one side, that's it. Because if you are in a fully modernist environment and your professor had authority and said, no, that's because out of context is your words against theirs. So now, how to challenge that? If we're talking about out of context, the Portuguese one should also be out of context on that sense, because now, but Brazil is not only um, a Portuguese-based country. You have German immigration, you have Italian immigration, you have French immigration. So what's there is not a proper pure Brazilian influence. And if we say Portuguese, we also say what Portuguese? Is it the Manuelino? Is it the Pombal? Which Portuguese? Are we going to the Mosque of Mértola because it's the only Islamic example that you have in Portugal? What Portugal are we talking about for Brazil? So, and I think that this out of context comes because you know very well that in Brazil, since the 1930s, with the Getúlio Vargas revolution, it was said that everything in Brazil was out of context, that the new Brazil had to embrace modernism as the values of the new Brazil, and that's how you ended up, boom, erasing everything. And you keep the Portuguese influence because all of you guys are speaking Portuguese. But if Getúlio Vargas could have had in his hand, he would have created his Getúlio's Vargas language, and then he would have erased Portuguese. What you cannot deny is that there was a heavy French influence in the 19th century architecture, and that cannot be denied. Now, if we're talking on a purist exercise, and if only the Portuguese only the Portuguese examples are in context, then the modernism, Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer, are not in context because they are not responding to that Portuguese heritage. But at the same time, Brazil is one of there are areas in Brazil where you have such windows which you don't have anywhere else in Portuguese-speaking countries, which means that they were taken from England. And I have seen pictures of Ouro Preto, where you have a lot of Chippendale furniture that obviously was coming from England. Wasn't coming from Lisbon, wasn't coming from Cadiz. So to that extent, and obviously when the Portuguese court moves to Brazil with Dom João, there is a lot of English people helping the country to upgrade it to the court level. So I think that the only way of challenging it is saying that the French influence cannot be denied, that Brazil as an empire who was bigger than Europe, was looking at Europe as a leveling point to present itself as a power equal to Europe. I think that's very important, because all the countries, I think that the only ones who were feeling they were different from the European continent were the United States. All the other countries were acknowledging to a smaller or bigger level their relationship, mostly with Spain and with Portugal. And a lot of them, I mean, mostly Argentina and Brazil, they started receiving immigration from all over the world. And when you start creating that, because you also have a Japanese community in Brazil, nobody talks about. So I think that's saying that things that architecture is out of context when it was built and it was requested by Brazilians, because we're not talking about all of a sudden Napoleon III invading what's the name, invading Brazil and then bringing French architecture there. No. We're talking about Brazilians calling it French architects, or Brazilians going to Paris, studying architecture in Paris, coming back, doing those buildings. If it was out of context, clients wouldn't have requested it. The government wouldn't have requested those buildings. So who are they to tell you what the context was when the context was showing you that. Another thing is that another different thing is that we're talking about that the historical conditions are not the ones that they like, because they're following this rhetoric from Getulio Vargas saying that it was not the right thing. And then we are talking about rewriting history, which is a completely different thing. And we have been talking before about that, no? That we are rewriting actually that history. We are losing all that heritage, classical heritage of the first half of the 20th century, because nobody worried, nobody cared about protecting it, because it was perceived as lack of interest, because the important thing is the old, is the past. And what is the past? The past is not our past. The past is the past of the people of the early 20th century. And that's something important that we need to challenge, in the sense that still in 21st century, our historiography, the history that we know, the history that we learn, the history that we teach, and what we are taught mostly, let's say at least at a level of popular culture, is the history of it as it was written at the beginning of 20th century. And that hasn't evolved. And that's why you find from time to time all these people who start having crazy ideas, because all of a sudden you discover that men were pink in early 20th century. And then why do we have that reaction? Because in the 1950s, wearing pink was a thing of old men. So that's why we had all these reactions. So we have it is quite interesting. And for example, I mean, I know that a lot in Islamic architecture, there were a series of scholars in Spain who did a certain degrees of researches that it still considered quite accurate and quite good, but some things that they couldn't know because they didn't dig further. They couldn't know about what was there before, etc., or new things were discovered. And that in Spanish historiography keeps updating. But when you read English historiography of Islamic architecture, it is still stuck on what Arthur Creswell wrote in the 1930s, which is what Leopoldo Torres Balbás and Caps Cazorla wrote at the beginning of 20th century. So I think that out of context, thinking that the French influence in Brazil is out of context is what is actually out of context, if that makes sense, Nicole. So being out of context is actually out of context. So Buccino Portuguese architecture count as appropriate for the area the building is built in, even though China is importing the values from the West, such as liberal democracies. Well, that's interesting. I think that the Chinese are embracing traditional Western architecture in a whimsical way, and that it depends a bit on what the party decides. The party wants to do something, and they find that they like Portuguese. They wouldn't have any problem in doing a copy of Central Lisbon, the same way that they rebuilt Heidelberg Castle to build a university, and they didn't have any problem, or that famous copy of Paris. But if you read a little bit, you realize that the only thing that the Chinese don't do or hardly do is Chinese architecture. They can be very good at copying French, copying Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Middle East, anything but Chinese.
They actually do stick traditional Chinese stuff on facades, on modernist facades, so that you know where to go into a building.
Yeah, but those more signaling, they put the lions, because you have here the peninsula, which is paid all by Chinese investors, and they have the two lions are having in buildings done by Chinese investors, where we were refurbishing a flat, and everything is with the red ribbons to give you good luck, etc. I think that's a different thing. It's a bit like the Japanese, no? They live in a completely modernist. Tokyo is a completely modernist city, but then you have the petty little things. You keep the tradition, a sort of probably the party would say superstitious bourgeois thing, but it's not.
I think it's a little more subtle than that. But look, in general, you're right. But I think it's a little more subtle.
That's interesting. No, in what sense?
It depends on where you are. Tokyo was actually burned down. It was a Japanese wooden city, Edo, in 1923, completely burnt. And then again, that was destroyed in World War II. So yes, it is very, very modern because that's what they were doing, that's what they had, and et cetera, et cetera. Other places retain at least a semblance of their traditional stuff, especially in the old parts of town, like everywhere else.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But I was struck by the Chinese, that wherever you went, there was always a genuine traditional Chinese touch on the street somehow in something, um, just to make it more bearable, because the modernist stuff wasn't taking it all, including they have these walls going around all their estates. They have these multiple 50-story building estates, but they all have a wall around them. That wall is a Chinese wall with tiles on top, and the bricks are the local bricks. And it's very curious how they maintain their Chinesiness. And there are several of them that try to incorporate Chinese structure shapes on them, especially on top or at a ground level. So yeah, I mean, it is like you say, but I think that it's a little more.
No, but you're right, and you have pointed out a very important thing, because what they are doing is that on top of the modernist building, when the modernist building is finished, they're adding the Chinese stuff.
Yes, yeah.
So this is what Clement Greenberg would call the redemptive power of kitsch. And to me, that's one of the most beautiful things that can happen. No, is the great example of the failure of modernism, when people, when when modernism has imposed you that aseptic thing, and you need to make it yours, and then you make it yours by making it traditional. You have the same in Spain, when all of a sudden they did all these buildings, and then in the space of 2-3 years you have tiles, you have flowers, you have pots everywhere, and that's the magic of it, and multicolor curtains and shutters, and that's the magic of it, and that's the best symbol, the happiest consequence of the failure of modernism, that people bring tradition back as soon as they inhabit a place.
That is the case, and actually, it's very strange that next to these modernist estates, you have full-blown Western, traditional Western architecture estates in China,
yeah,
gated communities, and also next door to Brasilia. On one side of Brasilia, you have the old favela or whatever, which is the most normal part of Brasilia. But on the other side, you have the wealthier communities and their gated communities with traditional architecture and traditional gateways on them. It's very curious how that works. The Japanese adoption of Western styles is also a very Japanese thing, because it goes through the Japanese mind. It goes through the Japanese cultural mind, which is, there's no similarity between it and the West. Just isn't. You might think that there's a similarity because you've seen whatever it is, concrete or bricks or whatever before. And that also includes their traditional buildings. If you can see the I think it's the Historical Museum in Nara. It is a full-on Western building, but it feels Japanese. There's something about it that makes it feel Japanese. And the building that you showed by those Germans also, I think I saw it in Tokyo. It's startling, but it's very Japanese, despite being Oriental. It's their idea, Occidental being Western, is their idea of what is Western, as much as it is Western.
It's yeah, you're totally right. It's always their vision. It's always their idea of how we are, because obviously if you start looking at the building, it has obviously the dormer on top of the column, which would never happen in the West. But yeah, for them it doesn't matter, because it's the aspiration. and probably the slope of the roof would the attached roof would be completely different. But they're mixing things in a happy way. And in general, Japanese architecture is always more, considering the Japanese are always very slim. I always find Japanese architecture much more chunkier than the European one, even when they're trying to imitate it. But that's probably because of the earthquakes.
I have no idea. I think it's the Japanese started out with two styles, actually with three styles. They had the Shinto style, they had the Chinese, what they call Chinese style, which is a straight ahead Chinese style, very, very ornate, like the Dawn Gate in Nikko. And they have the Zen style with the all the reductive stuff and the handmade wattle and daub and branches holding up tokonomas and all that kind of stuff. To express nature, etc., etc. And so they came from a plurality of styles, so it was not hard for them to adopt all this other stuff. And yes, they were the first. The Japanese army was the first army to use khaki uniforms in 1905 against the Russians when they beat the Russians. I did want to say something about Brazil. Downtown Rio has a whole neighborhoods which are old buildings from before World War II. Very fine fabric, really fine buildings. And they are sitting there, ignored, basically, half abandoned, not maintained, waiting, I don't know what for exactly. And it's like normal streets instead of the streets of the modern stuff. It's very curious what is happening everywhere. Thank you. I didn't mean to.
No. I really like that you have came today, so I'm very happy to have you here.
And this is very, very interesting the way you're presenting it and everything you're saying. It's very, very nice to encounter. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Doctor. So we have Christian. What do you do if the historiography of the country starts with modernism? My country lives in this strange limbo of identity in architecture. I think that it happens everywhere, because when I studied architecture in Spain, I think that the modernism has created this thing that anything before modernism is history of art, and only certain things are worth to be studied, which is seen through the optics of Kaufman, saying Logier, Dugan, Ledoux, Boulez, all these Frenchies. It's only the Frenchies are the ones who are worth studying. Then Leonardo Benevolo, because he's Italian, comes and starts talking about Piranesi and Winkelmann. But initially, it's just Kaufman. And Frampton follows that same lineage. No, it's just to put some historical justification to make it. But because for the modernist, history starts with them. History starts with the Bauhaus, which reforms history, period. It's the year zero for them. Before that, you study prehistory. And that is, and countries who have embraced modernism in a rigorous way, Brazil, for example. I mean, I wasn't, so I'm shocked to see that on Dominican Republic, but it's interesting, no? But that is because the modernism takes heaven by assault, and then converts that into the year zero. And then, therefore, for architecture, it's not that they are, and that's what they always say: be careful with the modernist, because they know more history than you think. They think that the fact that they hate history doesn't mean that they don't know it, and that is why that we were commenting a moment ago with Nicole about being out of context, because then you ask those modernists and they tell you exactly why they think that it is out of context, and then sometimes you have to say, yeah, you're right, but I am still going to use it. So that's why you need to have very, very clear historical arguments against them, or then shut up and note and then, okay, whatever you say, and you're not going to change my mind as a professional. That's the thing. But I see that a lot, and it happens a lot in the sense that there is this two-tier of architecture. You have like modern architecture, the world starts in the year zero of modernism, and our time is 1918 or if you want 1924 with Bergson architecture. That's the ground, the year zero of architecture as it should be, and anything behind is just art, crafts, applied arts, history, pretty things to keep in a vitrine, or as Dr. Bura was saying, just old houses being left to decay because they're out of interest. They are anomalies in the myth that you want to tell. That's why the Universidad Laboral de Gijón in Spain is such an uncomfortable building for many people. That's why the Aduana in Cádiz, they want to demolish it because it's out of interest. But then at the same time, buildings that were built in the 50s and that recite prices in architecture, like the pavilion of the Brussels exhibition of 1956, is just laying in ruins in Casa de Campo in Madrid. So, yeah, it's a bit of a shame, but that's, I mean, at the end of the day, it's, I mean, with Alex Kiss mentioned it in a very explicit way, it's the people who are controlling the narrative. And that's the important thing, is people are controlling the narrative, people are, for that. We need a recommended reading list from the CPI for digging deeper into all of this. The reading list, actually, and with this we're going to start wrapping up, is Modernismus by Reginald Blomfield. You have it in the WhatsApp group. If you don't have it, ask for it in the group. And that's the book we're going to read. In 2 weeks, we're going to start reading it. And then for the rest of the 5 remaining classes, we're going to be talking about modernism. And please read Modernism by Reginald Blomfield, because you're going to find a lot of arguments. Again, it's a beautiful book. And as Blomfield said in the book, I mean, it looks like I am preaching, but it's a book to read because it's the only source that we have. He was the only one that opposed modernism, and that's why modernism never allowed him, because few people have read modernism because the book has been out of print for 70 years. And people still, I mean, I was reading some reviews. Oh, Blomfield speaks like a kid when he criticizes Picasso, blah, 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 blah. So you can still see that, as Don Quixote would say, they bark, therefore we move. So I think that you have had several books in this list, but I think that, yeah, Modernismus could be a good one. And when we will be talking about modernism next week, I will give you a glimpse as well to a debate that was in the RABA in 1928, Modernismus is from 1933, and that debate shaped Blomfield to write Modernismus. And it's a very interesting debate that they did in the RABA, a bit of classical versus modernist, very interesting. And when you read what people were saying and the architects they liked, you realize that the younger people use they say that they like modern, but when they say modern, what they mean is what we could call nowadays Art Deco. And then when they talk about the modernist architects, everyone agrees that they don't like them. There is this sentence in which you say, we all agree that we don't like Le Corbusier, he represents the worst of Victorian values. And there you were. And nowadays, people define all of them as a retrograde Victorians. And there you had a group of retrograde Victorians telling that Le Corbusier was worse than the Victorians. So if that's not moving forward, I don't know what it is. And Bart, we will talk about that in the next class, but Blomfield explains specifically why he used the German term. He says it at the very beginning of the book. It's a bit of a odd, because Blomfield was a bit about that. The French are passionate, the Germans are ordered, the British have the best of both. So Blomfield was a bit of this thing. So he explains that. So there are things that we need to read as well in the context of the time, and in the context of we need to remember that Blomfield at the end of the day is a person born in the 1850s with all the advantages and disadvantages that it has. So that's what we need to bear in mind as well about him. But considering he was a person born in the 1850s, he was capable of fighting modernism, which no one of his generation did, because no one saw the danger. And at the end of the day, it's like here in UK, Blomfield has been forgotten, and Lutyens has been elevated as a god because Lutyens shut up and the modernists spare him for shutting up. But yeah, said this, we will have our next session on the 18th of October, just before the Inbound Congress. I hope to see all of you, or as much as you have possible, in the Inbound Congress. The CPI will be present there. We will be doing as well, in collaboration with the Traditional Architectural Group, the visit to the Victorian Albert Museum. And then we will be doing as well, we will be participating in some of the panels as well. So until then, I mean, we have a last question. You could argue what is thank you. You are very welcome. Philosophy Germans like he understood modernity better than no one else. Yeah, that's why Blomfield is pointing out on that direction. But yeah, until then, the recording will be uploaded probably tonight, so you will have it on YouTube very soon. And also for all of you who are watching us online, thank you very much for attending and for watching the video till the end. I know that they can be a bit long for YouTube, but we don't believe in short reels in the salon. But then usual, I mean, here is the title, Modernism of Regional Blomfield. It's in the WhatsApp group. You can join the WhatsApp group by clicking on the link on the YouTube channel. And thank you very much. And see you soon in 2 weeks and in the WhatsApp group at any time. Thank you and bye-bye.